Well, good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure and honor to be here at the National Archives, home of the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the Constitution. And I hope that we take this wonderful context as an inspiration for us today. My name is Irene Wu, and I'm at the Federal Communications Commission, where I'm acting as Chief Data Officer in the National Bureau. And I certainly want to thank the archivist and his team, Ken Thibodeau and Hung Nguyen, and all the people who put this together for this wonderful conference, and also to Jay Hamilton of Duke University, who put so much time and effort into making this possible. The Federal Communications Commission is the media regulator, and as such, we are very interested in the quality of news. And an essential aspect of the quality of news is the government's disclosure of its records and making information available to the public. So that's why I'm here today. We have four wonderful panelists, several of whom have posted in advance the comments that they're going to make today, and so I urge you to take a look at that on the conference website. Each of them is going to make a presentation of a few minutes, and then we'll have questions from the audience. The theme of our panel today is media access to federal government records. Okay, so our first speaker is Gary Bass. He initially asked me to introduce him as the President of the United States. We need a laugh. This is a government records workshop. Yeah, and it's early in the morning. Gary is the founder and executive director of OMB Watch, an outstanding civil society organization. He has been working in issues on public access for many years, and one of the software applications that his organization developed, fedspending.org, was used as the basis for usaspending.gov and was called by the LA Times modern-day transparency revolution. So Gary, perhaps you'll kick off the discussion.
Thanks, Irene. First, let me say that this is a particularly interesting panel to me because we have a mixture of government, journalists, and then me, which is whatever I am. I'm the advocate, I'm the consumer, and I'm the colleague, all in the same breath. And so today I want to come borrowing, if you will, from maybe Mark Antony's speech of friends, countrymen, and friend Roman's countrymen. I want to paraphrase. I actually am coming to praise President Obama, not to bury him. I think that it is remarkable that we have a president who his first action as President of the United States at 12:01 was to talk about how he wanted to become the most open and transparent administration ever. And he followed that with a number of policy efforts in a broad range of areas, including the two that David and Sandy talked about, dealing with classification and controlled unclassified information. He also did the Open Government Directive, but more than just and he did issues with the Freedom of Information Act, but even more than just the policy approach, he really embraced the use of interactive technologies. Think back just 2 years ago, and social media was not the lexicon inside government. Today it is. Maybe more to the heart of the matter, the concept of a data.gov was not even something dreamed of a couple of years ago, and now it's about how do we make something like that work well. In addition to that, we have the emphasis on no one item is going to change government, but we need to have a cultural change. We have to have a change of the environment of the way government operates. So all these are good signs. Having said that, something isn't quite right. We're still not there. It's not the transformative government that many of us hoped would happen. When I was working prior to this administration in bringing together a left-right coalition, we came up with 70 detailed recommendations endorsed by about 350 organizations and individuals. We just went back a couple weeks ago and looked at how those 70 recommendations stacked up in the Obama administration. And it was remarkable how many of the items were either started or actually completed. And yet, the sum of all those was not greater than any one element of it. In other words, we do not yet have a very open and transparent government. So what is it we need to do? How do we turn this? So my comments right now, and I will stick to 5 items, and I've learned as an advocate, by the way, you should never have more than 5 because you can hold up your fingers and still pound the table. So I will keep to 5 items, and I say this in the spirit that we now have a president and leadership from not only the White House, but from NARA and David and others in government that are rising to the challenge of how do we move to an open government. So my 5 points are, first, we really need to create the kind of environment whereby the default assumption is that information is disclosable. In other words, government has the affirmative obligation to put the information out. Let's get out of the mold of Freedom of Information Act where the public has to request information. Let's use that as the safety net now instead of the first resort. So to make the first point happen on that, the first thing is information that is collected by the government. They has to go through something called the Paperwork Reduction Act and clearance by the Office of Management and Budget. The first element is that agencies should have a disclosure plan when they submit for clearance for the collection of information. That's step 1. Step 2 is we need to develop a common standard, a floor, if you will, that all agencies agree to make available in a proactive form. Now, under the Open Government Directive, agencies are taking a great initiative, in certain agencies, are taking great initiative to put information out voluntarily. It happens that most of that information tends to be mission-driven. That is, whatever the focus of the agency is. What we need to complement that with is the kind of accountability information that all agencies must make available. Things like calendars of senior level people. Things like all communications with Congress. Things like inspectors general reports. We need to have a certain standard, and I include in that financial information. For example, why is it we still do not have copies of the contracts that the government enters into, redacting proprietary information, but make that voluntarily available so we can see whether or not the public is getting a good deal. So the first point is make sure there's a clearance process that you talk about disclosure. The second is to establish a common floor that all agencies must abide by, and they can go beyond that, but start with the floor. The third is to address exactly what David and Sandy were talking about, and that is address the national security classification and national security secrecy problem. I view it as 2 distinct issues. One is the classification problem that they were talking about, which is really to say the overclassification problem. It seems to me that one of the things we can do under President Obama's executive order on national security classification is really put some teeth into it, including right now agencies are supposed to be going through a process for next June around a review of what the classification guidance is. We should put teeth into that. That's one concrete step that can be done. A second under the national security piece is let's embolden and make proper the use of the state secrets privilege. The president started the process with a Department of Justice memo, but at that time, the press release that came out from Department of Justice also indicated that there'd be an opportunity for the courts to review, possibly in camera, in private, the justification for invoking the state secrets privilege. That policy has never come out, and it's time to get that policy together and put out. So that's the third, is dealing with national security issues. The fourth deals with the critical issue of garbage in, garbage out. We have got to improve data quality. We've got to improve the information that's made available to the public. Until we do that, we will be in a vicious cycle of maybe getting the information, but it not being reliable. And that leads to the final point, and while I'm still pounding the table. My fifth point is we have got to come up with new mechanisms to enforce the first four. If we don't come up with those mechanisms, we will have a perpetual problem with the next administration or the administration after that. We have got to come up with some mechanism, whether it is codifying it in law, whether it is giving citizen rights to sue, whether it is about a cultural notion within the government to praise people who do good work on disclosure. We have got to come up with a system that we all agree on upon in this room to come up with an enforcement mechanism. So, having said that, I'm optimistic. I look forward to the discussion we're going to have because I think the whole notion of improving the public's right to know hinges on a collaborative effort. Thanks, Irene.
Thank you. All right, next is Sarah Cohen. For over 10 years, she was an investigative reporter at the Washington Post, and prior to that, a reporter in Florida. She is now at Duke University, where she is Knight Professor of the Practice of Journalism and Public Policy.
Thank you. What he said, I think we'll just start with that. You know, it was a little more than a year ago that Gary kindly invited me to talk at a panel at OMB Watch about just these issues. And at the time, many folks were pretty optimistic, and I think we were making the exact same points then that we're making today. So I think the point about that a lot has happened but not much has changed is a pretty good way of thinking about this. I'd like to back up a little bit and think about what the point of open records is in the first place, whether it's under FOIA or whether it's under an open government directive or whether it's under a proactive disclosure or an open government floor, because this administration has outlined several different purposes of it, and I'd like to focus on the accountability issue. And the first idea of that is that we are allowed to know what government is doing with our money and in our name. And that's a really important way of thinking about the whole point of open government. And when we want to hold the government accountable, we need the artifacts of governing. And what I mean by that is all information about spending, inspecting, prosecuting, regulating. Anytime the government puts its hands on something, we should be able to get the artifact of those hands. And so with that idea, I think that one of the issues that hasn't changed, and what I want to talk about is some ways to maybe, very practical ways to make that change, is that we want to institutionalize the concept of open records and of proactive disclosure. What my goal would be over the next year and a half, or possibly 6.5 or whatever it would be, depending on the election results, is to really make it so that nobody could turn back the clock. Whatever progress is made in terms of a culture of open records, then maybe we could never turn back the clock. And the biggest change that I think needs to happen from the government side, and what I'm going to be really interested in hearing about is what can we do from the public to help this happen, is that the default position remains in most agencies and in almost every place that I've dealt with, including this White House, that the government owns the records and that it's your responsibility to pry them loose, to give them a good reason to release them, rather than that the public owns these records and there has to be some good reason to keep them secret. And that difference in mindset is one that I think has to change before we can get anywhere else. I've filed dozens of public information requests in my career. I don't know whether it's scores, but it's definitely dozens. And you know, in the federal FOIA, I like this idea of moving beyond FOIA because I have often sent birthday cards to my FOIAs. Happy anniversary, it's 1 year. Happy anniversary again, it's another year. Oh. And I've never had an agency meet the deadline on time. It's usually 6 to 8 months, and that's before the appeal to get more information. So it really takes a lot of work, and the problem is it takes a lot of work on both ends. It's not just me who's doing this work. There is someone working for Will Kammerer on the other side who's doing just as much work to try to figure out what's going on. I have in my written comments several very detailed ideas on how we might change some of this to make some things better. But I wanted to mention a couple of things that we might think about as other things. As a reporter, I have never been allowed in the federal system, and particularly after about 94, 95, I was never able to actually talk to the people who know anything about the records. And so I'm either pushed into the public information officer, I can't talk with you until we get permission from the PIO, or file a FOIA. Those are the two default answers. And until we're able to spend more time talking with the people who understand the records, we can't make good requests, and we don't even know whether it's already available. So that line of communication is incredibly important, and I think that some of the FOIA offices are starting to become more interactive. But I did want to mention, I'll just make a little tweak on this, that if you look at usaspending.gov or recovery.gov, the only way to contact them is to fill out an email form on the website itself. There's no phone number and no indication of what agency you should call. So that idea of making an open form of communication across people, I think at some point a lot of government folks became kind of behind a wall. And that is one thing that this administration has done a lot of work to remove, and I hope that that can be a little bit more institutionalized. And that it's institutionalized for not just regular citizens, but also for journalists, because frankly, journalists are often treated differently and sometimes not as well as regular people who are looking for things. Another thing that I did want to mention is the idea that we have put a lot of time and effort in agencies in creating what I would call, at the most harsh level, a fake set of records. As an example, there is, in most agencies, the public schedule of the secretary. That has nothing to do with what the secretary actually did those days. It's not infrequent for those schedules to have no public events listed as the entire schedule for weeks on end. So when we talk about a floor of records, I want to make sure that we're talking about the real records and not the public set that differs from the real set. In terms of, I know that I've spent years arguing with agencies trying to get the actual desk calendar of a secretary. And every lawsuit that's been brought on this going back, I believe, 100 years, has said that those desk calendars are public. So it's an issue. And I want to say that this isn't an easy task. Elizabeth Warren at the Treasury Department made a huge effort to make sure that her schedule in all detail is available in an electronic open source way, in a way that can be searched and used as a database. And there was a blog post talking about how difficult that was, and it was much more difficult than they thought it would be. I'm hoping that after the first several months, it's not so hard anymore. But perhaps finding a way, using technology to get records like that so that they're easily redacted and easily posted might be easier than setting up side systems that aren't real. And the same thing happens with spending records, personnel records, and a whole bunch of others. Gary talked about contracts, and I know that we kind of harp on contract and grant materials, and if you think about it, there's a good reason for it. This is our money that's going out, and the idea that that's secret is not very comforting. So, but there are a series of policies that preclude agencies from releasing a lot of contract and grant information. I'm sure many of you have heard of reverse FOIA actions, in which a corporation can say, you didn't ask me whether this should be released, so I'm going to sue you to stop it. And we just saw a recent Supreme Court decision on that. But those policies came kind of out of thin air. And I've spent a lot of time before Sunshine Week trying to figure out where those policies came from. And it's a patchwork of executive orders, special exemptions that are for very detailed sets of records that are now being used across other record sets. And it's maybe time to review those kinds of policies that prevent proactive disclosure and really inhibit those who want to have an open government from being able to do it. And I just wanted to follow up on one other thing. We're here partly talking about technology and open records, and I know there's a whole panel on that later on today. But Sandy Unger talked a little bit about electronic methods of classifying and declassifying records and context accumulation. There are other contracts that the government is using to do its own work. For example, in regulatory comments, clustering mechanisms to find similar documents across an agency set of comments, or different ways of getting effectively transcripts out of audio and video in the defense arena. And one other thing that would really help in terms of the ability to use federal documents once we were able to get them would be to have access to some of the technology that the federal government is already funding, but that is proprietary and very expensive and out of reach of most news, or of every news organization, I wouldn't say most. So it's something to think about, that when agencies invest in ways in making their records open, that they also offer that technology to the people who are going to be using it. I think the other comments I had were really quite detailed, and I wanted them kind of in the written record, but I don't know that it's worth going through them here. So I'm going to pass it on to,
Okay, thank you, Sarah.